this has been the problem since 2007, since Calderon, the Mexican president at the time, and George W. Bush launched this horrific war. The problem has been the deconsolidation of the narcotics groups.
To understand geopolitics, you must have the freedom to be honest. The More Freedom Foundation podcast. Hello, Rob. How are you?
Hey, Rory. To be honest, I'm kind of jacked up.
Uh-oh.
I didn't sleep very well last night and had to finish a video right before this recording.
Okay.
So I indulged in a little caffeine, which is something I tend to avoid. So for someone who's usually so substance averse, I'm going to be in the stratosphere for this podcast recording. So I'd like to apologize in advance.
But you also may crash, which is something to look forward to.
Indeed. I could actually fall asleep halfway through this recording. So that's something to be excited about. I feel bad because it's such a serious topic, and I am a little loopy for it. But hey, I guess let's give it a whirl.
Okay, so what are you in the mood for this week?
I think we're going to talk about Mexico, and we can take that in a lot of different directions. I think it's going to be a long enough conversation that we're probably just going to do this as a part one and a part two, but it is obviously Mexico-U.S. relations that we'll be discussing today.
Something incredible I found out recently is Mexico's got a bigger population than Russia, and it's massively increasing because it's although American media would portray it that it's mostly Mexicans coming to America, it's quite often people from the likes of Honduras or Nicaragua are moving to Mexico and then from there moving on. So it's a great destination with a bustling population.
And not just that, Rory, you've got tons and tons of American retirees moving south of the border. I was at a wedding in San Miguel de Allende some years back, and they said that it was actually quite hard for Mexicans to buy property downtown because there were so many American retirees who'd fallen in love with the city down there.
Would that be more North Mexico, or what parts do the Americans like the most?
Everywhere. There's very serious U.S. populations throughout, well, not everywhere, of course. I think famously, was it Acapulco used to be a big destination for U.S. tourists and is now viewed, I'm not sure if this is still current, but at least for a lot of the teens, it was viewed as a no-go zone because of narco activity. But what's surprising, and I think unacknowledged, is the extent to which U.S. tourism, not just U.S. tourism, but U.S. citizens living in Mexico, in spite of the horrors of the past 15 years of drug war, it's something that continues. And I would say, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but might even be accelerating.
Okay, well, I've heard some news that cities like Mexico City have now a lower crime rate or, homicide rate than the likes of Philadelphia in America. So I don't know whether that's Mexico getting better or America getting worse.
It's hard to say how seriously to take those numbers, but I do know that Mexico City is safer than a lot of the country. It's interesting, in today's video, or rather the video that I just uploaded today, and I guess would be 4 or 5 days old by the time folks see this, I talk about a video uploaded by somebody else who has very alarmist approach to what's going on in Mexico. And honestly, I think that's largely justified. What's going on in Mexico is pretty horrible, but...
Yeah, it's downright terrifying.
But there are a lot of other aspects to the story that just aren't told. For example, there are large swaths of territory in Mexico that the federal government is losing control of to some degree, and that's terrifying. But a lot of those, it's sort of a minor version of what I complain about in the Middle East a lot, is that a lot of those territories are wilderness to some degree. And certainly a hotspot for U.S. migration to Mexico is just that whole part of, Mexico is sort of this large cone with a tail. And in the tail, there's certainly some narcotic smuggling activity in that tail, but dramatically less than there is up against the U.S. border. So that whole very densely populated tail there, say from Mexico City and then to the east, is a lot safer and a lot more consolidated.
Well, it seems to be kind of in and around Mexico City on that longitude. Seems to be where the main population is, almost like in the middle. But yeah, the majority towards America seems to be very sparsely populated.
Oh yeah. I think they are deserts, as is a lot of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Texas has the third of Texas, or maybe it's not even a third, where all of its large cities are focused in the east of Texas, and then you've got progressively more and more sparsely covered territory through the miracles of air conditioning, irrigation, and just American insanity. Arizona has now become a big center of population, but that is also mostly desert, and most of the Mexican states fronting on those states are also quite desert. And some of them are really vacillating in between the control of the Mexican federal government and these armed criminal gangs. And that is legitimately terrifying. But I do believe that the much more densely populated areas in the south of Mexico are a lot safer. I had friends recently buy some property in the Yucatan Peninsula, and that's would be a strange decision to make if Mexico was truly as close to spinning out of control as some people like to portray it.
Are they making out it's on, tipping into civil war?
Well, I think to tip into civil war, you'd have to have a much more consolidated group of folks on the other side. I think that the problem, and this has been the problem since 2007, since Calderon, the Mexican president at the time, and George W. Bush launched this horrific war. The problem has been the deconsolidation of the narcotics groups, the various groups selling drugs. The fact that, they've gone from, this is I take from a recent Task and Purpose video, they've gone from 3 or 4 cartel groups into 150 separate groups. And it's the wars between those groups that are just churning up such a horrific loss of life. So I don't know if civil war is the appropriate way to talk about it. I think in the back half of this presentation, we'll get super speculative and talk about some civil war options that are on the table, I believe, chiefly if the United States makes some really bad choices. But I think we should focus on the history of this conflict, the history of U.S.-Mexican relations in this first half.
Currently, I'd say they're very good, but there was a time they were incredibly bad when America managed to expand a lot. I think, was it the biggest expansion in American history?
I've been reading a lot about this, Rory, and it's a common weakness for myself. I don't actually look into the numbers. I'm not sure if the Louisiana Purchase was bigger than the extraordinary annexation of New Mexico and California. Also, it gets a little more complicated because it was a multi-decade process, and Texas became independent and was its own country for a while before it was annexed. And then in 1848, can't remember the exact dates, but in the mid-19th century, the United States essentially started a war against Mexico, stole New Mexico, Arizona, and California. If you count New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Texas, as well as I believe chunks of some other states all together, then I would say definitely that was the single largest acquisition of current U.S. land. But if you consider Texas as a separate process, which you probably should to be completely historically accurate, if you see them as 2 separate chunks, then I'm not sure. Maybe the Louisiana Purchase was bigger than the Mexican-American War, but I do not know the math. I do not know the math.
But both have a shared history that Napoleon helped out greatly in their independence.
I think that's a fair way to talk about it. Well, I don't know if Napoleon helped out greatly with U.S. independence, because that was a solid In the seven,
But was France not America's first ally?
of course, France was America's first ally, but it was a very different France in the 1770s than it was in the 1790s and the early 1800s. No question, you're exactly right. The Napoleonic Wars were a key motivating factor in the independence of all of the Spanish Americas. The United States itself became independent about 30 to 40 years earlier, depending on the country you're measuring from. And at that point, we didn't even have a revolution. And Napoleon was sort of an outgrowth of the French Revolution in 1789. I guess he sort of started coming on the scene in the mid 1790s. The exact particulars escape me, and became the first consul slash dictator slash emperor slash what have you in the very first years of the 1800s, I believe. Though he was already more or less in charge, I think, by like 1799? I don't know. Anyway, the United States had been independent for almost a quarter century before Napoleon was the big deal. But what Napoleon did do was make the incredible mistake of trying to crush the Haitian Revolution. And after that point, he decided that after losing that fight against the Haitians, who successfully defended their independence, Napoleon decided that North America just wasn't worth it. And what he did was sell the Louisiana Purchase, an extraordinary stretch of land, far beyond just Louisiana itself, going up. It sort of balloons larger as it goes further north, the Louisiana Purchase. In, 1802 sticks in my head, but that could be wrong. 1804, maybe.
And don't all the rivers come together and end up near New Orleans?
I believe that is the case. The Mississippi River ends at New Orleans.
So if you own that, the end of that river, you can essentially control all of those huge amount of navigable rivers as well.
For sure, but France already had title to that territory, disputed a little bit with the Spanish, though even at that point, the Spanish were becoming sort of less and less of a competitor and more prey than predator in that era. But so Napoleon had the title to that, had all kinds of ambitions. It was very scary, quite literally around the turn of the century from the 1700s to the 1800s. It was very scary for folks in the United States, the idea that Napoleon could set up from New Orleans, move up to St. Louis, and I think Detroit already existed at that point, and I feel like Michigan wasn't part of the Louisiana Purchase, but I could be wrong about that. Regardless, Napoleon screwed up terribly in Haiti, decided North America was no longer worth paying attention to, and sold probably the most extraordinary real estate deal in American history. Just sold the Louisiana Purchase to President Thomas Jefferson, who heavily violated his constitutional principles to do something that I think he correctly saw as being in the long-term interest of the United States, which was not, however, in the long-term interest of either the Spanish America or the successor Mexican state. This set up the conflict that ended up dismembering the initial Mexican state. Exact dates for Mexican independence escape me, I'm sorry, but I think it was somewhere in the 1820s or thereabouts. I know they were fighting heavily for it earlier than that. Almost as soon as Mexico became independent, within the working lifetime of somebody who might have fought for Mexican independence, they were already disputing the Texas territory between the United States and settlers from the United States that agreed to be Mexican citizens and then quickly abandoned that when they decided that they could do better by first being independent and then affiliating themselves with the United States. It wasn't always an uncritical or unified goal in the United States to rip off Mexico as badly as we did. There were a lot of folks, believe among them a guy from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, who were pretty appalled by the Mexican-American War and fought against it pretty heavily, but it was not a successful fight against the Mexican-American War. And I read a book about this recently, and there's a reason we don't talk much about the Mexican-American War is because there's just nothing redeeming about it from the U.S. standpoint. It was premeditated theft and a great deal of murder, and we carried it out successfully and stole a huge chunk of land that is now, I would argue, quite irrevocably a part of the United States today.
What was more tragic is, although Mexico, you couldn't necessarily call it a native state, it was significantly better for the natives than America would have been at the time, if I'm right. So it's almost like they're double stealing Native American land, if that makes any sense, or Native Mexican land in this sense.
I think that you can say that probably fairly, but those are really difficult judgments to make. Like, I get kind of angry when people are like, oh, Canada was so much better to the indigenous than the United States was, or Mexico was so much better to the, and I think that the sad truth of that is that Mexico and Canada were better for indigenous populations because they just weren't there in numbers. And as soon as Canadians or Mexicans got to a given territory in sufficient numbers to brutalize the indigenous, they did so. I don't think in Canada, this was a really popular argument maybe a decade ago that, the Canadians were so much better to the indigenous and wouldn't everything have been better if the British Empire had won and the United States had never become independent. And people don't talk about that in Canada so much anymore after recent revelations, I think, of 20th century ethnic cleansings and really horrifying stories about schools.
The Canadian way reminds me similar to Australia, where it wasn't quite, let's get all the army together and do a massive massacre. It felt a lot more, let's get some good old boys and we'll have some fun killing some natives this weekend. It feels a lot more built into the culture, but kind of more drips and drabs. You don't have this big grand document that says, so many thousand were killed today. It's a lot more just slow and steady murder, which, Canada has unearthed recently, it seems.
Yeah. So it's all pretty damn grim.
Yeah.
I've read a book recently called, I think it was Indigenous Continent. It's very popular. It's by a Finnish guy or something. It's odd development. And he's written a bunch of books, I think, on the Lakota Empire and the Comanche Empire. And this is sort of his big argument. And I didn't really buy it. His argument is that actually the indigenous were much more successful in defending themselves than we typically give them credit for. I think that the nastiest thing about indigenous, the general American approach to the indigenous and the U.S. American approach specifically is that every step of the development of the United States was reliant, for 200 years, was reliant on the indigenous to some extent. Like, there would have been no beaver market that established large European populations in North America if it weren't for Native Americans trapping those beavers. There would have never been a large tobacco economy that sort of began the process of populating the South, the American South, the U.S. South, without the indigenous folks introducing those colonists to tobacco.
But also, wasn't there a lot of colonists would have been taught how to farm in the Americas by the natives?
Oh, absolutely. That is
because they brought a lot of the ways they did things in Europe, which just didn't work.
Yeah, that's a very clear dynamic, just sort of being introduced to maize. And just people, like, over the course of decades or even centuries, indigenous people became a key part of the way that these economies functioned. And then when enough Europeans showed up that it was advantageous to completely dispossess these people who had been a key part, key trading partners for centuries, the United States went ahead and did it over and over and over again, which is just a little dark. It's a little dark, but more than a little dark, in fact. But that's sort of what we're dealing with here. And the Mexican state was another sort of victim of a process like that, though honestly it happened much more quickly. Like I said, the independence of Mexico is less than 50 years for sure, and perhaps significantly less than that before the the United States ran off with New Mexico, California, and
So yeah, they would have got their independence around 1810.
so that's does Father Hidalgo, or am I completely? Are you looking at that now? But I think that the process started in 1810, but the Spanish fought over that for quite some time. And you know what? I measure American independence from 1776, so I should not have a double standard, and I should go with 1810. Thank you, Rory.
Okay, well, the Spanish accepted the independence on August the 24th, 1821.
1820, but it's 1810, because if it's 1776 in the United States, and I believe that, then it's 1810 in Mexico.
Yeah.
So
one of America's most important trading partners.
Oh, absolutely.
It trades more so with China, does it?
But not by much.
But it shows you just how, when you consider how often American media would talk about China when they should talk about Mexico slightly more.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if we should jump all the way to the front, but one of the saddest things about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is been rebranded under Trump very uninventively as the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement.
Clunky, but it's straight to the point.
Yeah, straight to the point, but also it's USMC, which is also, I think, an acronym that I always associate with the United States Marine Corps, so it's just very confusing all around. Regardless, the great tragedy of NAFTA is that we integrated the economies in a very serious way, which should have been extraordinarily beneficial for Mexico, was extraordinarily beneficial for Mexico, for Canada and the United States, and was beneficial to Mexico to a degree, but to a much smaller degree, because very shortly after NAFTA was signed and put into place, the United States opened up to China in a massive way. So a lot of the low-income manufacturing that NAFTA's architects were expecting to pour into Mexico poured into China instead. Regardless, NAFTA and USMC established a accelerating and still accelerating degree of integration between the U.S., Mexican, and Canadian economies. And I don't think that integration is going to stop ever. I think that there are a lot of massive roadblocks in the way of that integration, but namely the narco war that Bush and Calderon started back in 2007. Also, as a differing fact, it is a different factor, the broader dependence of the Mexican and U.S. economies on illicit drugs. I think those are two separate things that people don't separate out enough. Also, just the general level of Republican Party bigotry against folks who speak Spanish. But I think that's fading rather quickly as they realize how many Mexicans and folks of Mexican descent like to vote for Republicans.
Well, I thought it might have been, I know for Cubans that tend to move to America, they like the Republicans. But did you ever hear, apparently before September 11th, the Republicans were going to focus heavily on Hispanic market and try to integrate them into their core demographic. But because of it, they focused totally on terrorism, and that they were distracted by that. And then the whole Hispanic thing fell by the wayside. Did you know much about that? Or?
Well, sure. George W. Bush billed himself, the Bush family in general. Jeb Bush, I think, actually speaks Spanish, and I'm sure George W. Bush has tried. George W. Bush was the governor of Texas. Jeb Bush was the governor of Florida. So Latino outreach was always a big factor in the way they work, to the extent that Jeb Bush has a personal fortune outside of the Bush family in general, which is impossible lines to draw. I believe he built that working with Cuban-American real estate developers in Florida. So sure, that was going to be a big focus of the W. Bush administration, and it ended up not being it. I think there's this classic Reagan quote where he sort of says that Latin Americans, or that probably wasn't even the terminology back then, Hispanics were Republicans. They just did.
It may not bear repeating what was said back then.
No, because he was.
It wasn't one of the bad ones.
No, Reagan has a great record with Latin Americans. In fact, massive So the nastiest thing that Republicans can say about a plan by Republicans or Democrats vis-a-vis immigrants today is amnesty, is to talk about an amnesty for illegal immigrants. And Ronald Reagan's major policy on immigration in the 1980s was a massive, massive amnesty for illegal immigrants. So he very much predated this Republican hate fest towards Mexicans. But yeah, so this was a focus for Republican Party elites for quite some time. In the late 90s, early 2000s, before the financial crisis, there was a real legitimate influx of migrants from Mexico. A lot of folks tie this directly to NAFTA because the Mexican economy was opened up to U.S. agricultural exports. That meant that a lot of Mexican agriculture became unviable economically. So there really was a flood into the United States in the 90s and the 2000s. And despite the best efforts of Reagan and his administration and the Bush family, being anti-Mexican became very core to Republican Party identity, as we certainly saw with Donald Trump in 2016, build the wall, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we should talk a little bit more about some of the intervening history before we get into the late 20th and early 21st century. Specifically, I want to talk about this because, well, the reason we're talking about this at all, why Mexico's coming up, why I've been looking into it recently, is that over the past 4 months, we've been seeing this growing push for some kind of U.S. engagement in Mexico. Now, of course, nobody's calling it an invasion, but I think I tweeted this recently. You can look at it the way that Vladimir Putin looks at it in Ukraine. It's not a war or invasion. It's a special operation. We're just going to send in the special forces and take on the narcos. To be clear, there's no concrete plan at this point, but the volume of people talking about it is getting really, really troubling. It's been showing up a lot in the U.S. Congress in recent weeks. Sure, this is at the crazy fringes of the U.S. Congress.
What have they been, specifically asking for in Congress?
Well, it varies. You've got a Republican presidential candidate who's not actually in Congress, who's talking explicitly about sending special forces into Mexico. A wide variety. I haven't looked into it in too much detail. I do know that the survivors of drug overdose in the family have been trotted out in Congress to give testimony about the ways that these terrible narcos killed their children. Some truth to that to some degree, but I probably don't think it's worth launching a major Iraq war style invasion because of some drug overdoses.
Did any of the doctors that were pushing fentanyl ever go to jail?
Well, I think you know the answer to that, Rory.
Yeah. It's a bit like those bankers after 2008.
Yeah. I think that there's been some success in the courts, but I think even the major businesses that would have to at least pay out some money have all declared bankruptcy long after sending all their ill-gotten rewards into triple protected trusts or what have you. So no, we are, it's interesting how much of a cultural impact complaining about the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma has had. I've been impressed, frankly. There's been multiple films and multiple documentaries, best-selling books, and at the end of that's yielded very little. And I think that we may be at a point where folks are realizing we're not going to be able to get at that money. We're not going to be able to get at those families. So we want to blame somebody else.
What was horrible is the first Sackler did seem to be a genuinely good man, highly intelligent. He sort of moved. It was like the early days of, they didn't really treat pain. They used to just electrocute people, and he figured out, give them the drug that's kind of naturally being created. So the OG Sackler did do some incredible help, but it felt like once he died and got shifted out, the other ones just spent all that intelligence on evil, going out of their way to just, basically, get people addicted as much as possible and sell it as much as possible.
I don't know too much about the details, but my understanding is that, yeah, it is a great American story of rise and fall. It was apparently an impressive multi-generational business. I live about 2 miles from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Sackler family built out massive swaths of it over across the 20th century. The current generation, or the generation that I believe is in the process of dying of guilt, one would hope. Yeah, quite monstrous in what they did to this country.
So yeah, I think it's more them you should try to prevent than invading Mexico.
That's certainly true, Rory, but it's kind of hard to get a special forces raid on Greenwich, Connecticut.
I'm sadly reminded of something you've said previously on the podcast. I've said about how America could be more in touch with its homeless and try to help them instead of when someone's in trouble abroad, it's bring out the Navy if Somali pirates are involved. And you said you can't get a $1 billion contract for helping the homeless.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's something similar.
I think it's very similar. But what's troubling, Rory, is how loud this is getting and how close, I believe, we're getting to violating one of the central rules of American foreign policy. It's a rule that I think folks have just forgotten, and it's a rule that we learned at great cost. I'm not sure whether this is the second or the third most recent invasion of the United States, but I think it's really the only land invasion of the United States that I can think of in the 20th century. Pearl Harbor was not actually a land invasion. It was a missile strike and then a runaway. But in the early 20th century,
I think there was one U-boat once landed and was immediately discovered, and they were arrested. But yeah, it is 0 to none.
Yeah. But in the course of the Mexican Revolution between 1911 and 1920, don't quote me on that, a group of Mexican fighters invaded the United States and destroyed a town. They were quickly fought off, but I think that is a pretty calamitous development that was, in fact, as is the current narco war, the result of U.S. meddling in Mexico, in Mexican politics. Specifically, with the Mexican Revolution, they had very quickly, within a year or two, they had managed to freely elect for the first time in close to half a century. I can't recall exactly how long Porfirio Diaz was in power, but in 1911 or 1912 or so, they elected a, well-meaning rich guy with liberal inclinations, who was certainly an improvement over the multi-decade dictator that had preceded him. But the ambassador on the ground, he sort of shades of Tom Cotton, had decided that actually what was happening in Mexico, the election of this pretty vaguely liberal rich guy, was actually some kind of fiendish communist plot, and actually everything in Mexico would be great if this vaguely liberal rich guy were killed. This vaguely liberal rich guy is basically, you look at his biography and like, oh, that's like George Washington. Like that's like exactly the same sort of person who was big in the founding of the United States. And of course, this ambassador did not personally kill the democratically elected Mexican president, but he approved of it. He organized the next government in the American embassy. It's actually called, I think in history, it's called the plot of the embassy or something. And then he did approve the murder of this president. And of course, brought about exactly the socialist-leaning anarchic chaos that he had thought that Maduro was carrying out. The echoes in 2007 and Bush pressuring Calderon into turning the Mexican drug war from a murdering 10,000 people a year thing into a murdering 30 to 40,000 people a year thing. The parallels are quite on point. And you could actually probably say that the George W. Bush administration wasn't paying enough attention to the lessons of, man, that would have been a good angle in the video. I'm angry I'm missing that. That George W. Bush didn't pay enough attention to the lessons of 1916 and Pancho Villa's invasion of the United States. The Mexican Revolution, because of the U.S. ambassador specifically, went from possibly being resolved in 2 years to taking 10 years, something on the order of 1 million lives, the invasion of the United States, and the complete breakdown of economic relations between the United States and Mexico. They were nowhere near as important as they are today, back then, of course. But in the early 20th century, the United States and Mexico were still shared a 1,700-mile border, and there were serious economic relations that were disrupted for a solid decade. And I think this disruption of economic relations for a decade and the small matter of an invasion of the continental United States introduced a little caution into Washington, D.C. planning when it comes to Mexico that you don't really see anywhere else in Latin America, or honestly, anywhere else in the world. Over the course of the 20th century, in the Cold War in Latin America, the United States has a terrible, terrible history. I'd sort of talked about this in a video, saying, if any politician suggested land reform, or a Catholic priest suggested that, maybe this oligarchy isn't so great, the United States would be involved to some degree in assassinating that person. And a lot of the problems with Central America today stem from the U.S. unwillingness to accept anything even vaguely left-leaning from a Latin American government. Meanwhile, in Mexico, from the 1920s until the year 2000, Mexico was run by one party called the Institutional Revolutionary Party. In the 1940s, Mexico nationalized their oil industry. I think it would be unfair to say that this was part of this was something that the U.S. would just generally accept all the time. This was in the magical moment of FDR's good neighbor policy, when he figured that he had enough to focus on with the Great Depression and Japan and Germany, so he wasn't as interested in regime changing as really every president.
Wasn't there also a small worry that they might side with the enemy, so keep them happy?
I think that's possible. I don't know. I think that was more of a problem in South America for sure. Argentina specifically, there were a lot of South American countries who might have been more sympathetic towards the Germans in World War II. But in World War I, perhaps you're thinking of the Zimmerman telegram, the World War I issue where the Germans tried to get Mexicans on side. The thing was that during World War I, that was the period of the Mexican Revolution. So while the Zimmerman telegram was used as part of the casus belli for the Americans to go to war against Germany, I don't think it was as seriously threatening the idea of Mexico going over as it would have been during World War II. But I don't think the Mexican World War II politicians really flirted with the Nazis much. I could be wrong about that, but I don't remember anything along those lines. But for sure, yeah, basically the FDR's policy towards all of Latin America was we're going to do more carrot than stick because we have other concerns. And honestly, it was the most successful Latin America policy that the United States has ever had. For the first decades of the United Nations, the Americas generally voted together as a bloc. It was only in the 1950s when the fail nerds of the CIA and Washington, D.C. kind of destroyed that really good vibe that FDR had established.
Did they do much to help, or were they more just letting them do their own thing?
The intricacies of the good neighbor policy are something I need to look further into, Rory.
America did genuinely, physically help. They just didn't meddle, and things kind of, grew naturally well.
I'm not sure what the aid policies were at that point. I'm sure there was something. I'm sure it was desperately meager by today's standards. But I think the miraculousness of FDR's good neighbor policy was the contrast between what had gone before.
To today?
Well, certainly to today, but no, before the good neighbor policy in the 1920s, the 19-teens, I just talked about how we turned a 2-year civil war in Mexico into a 10-year civil war, killing 1 million people. In 1915, I think it was, the Marines actually went into Haiti specifically to rob the bank. Like, we just went in specifically to steal all the gold out of Haiti's central bank.
One of the poorest countries in the world.
Yes.
Wasn't it the first to abolish slavery?
Yeah, it's well, it depends on how you measure that.
Yeah.
I think so, probably. But most importantly...
There's definitely an argument there.
But more importantly, it's I think the only, or certainly the first, self-liberated slave republic. Essentially, the slaves rose up and liberated themselves, and we've been punishing them for it ever since, for about 200 years.
And the French have been.
Yes. But so, yeah, 1915, the U.S. Marines invaded Haiti to steal all the gold in the central bank. We had multi-decade horrific occupations of the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, other countries. So yes, the good neighbor policy's main thing was just not meddling as much in Latin America, but it was a really big shift. Just not meddling was a tremendous improvement. That good neighbor policy was abandoned by the 1950s, and while we weren't as bad as we were in the teens, 20s, and 30s, we were pretty bad. Destabilizing, I would argue that most of the nightmare that is Central America today is a result of U.S. meddling. But Mexico we largely steered clear of until 2007. There's, of course, a lot of detail. There's financial interweavings. There's corruption and co-opting of Mexican elites that the United States has done, arguably more successfully there than we have anywhere else in the world. But we just were much more careful. And I think since 2007, we've gotten a lot less careful. And that's a real problem.
When these politicians are all about, sending special forces into Mexico, is there not American special forces in Mexico, at least in a training capacity, to train up these anti-narco police?
Definitely there is training. Actually, I should not say definitely. I assume there is significant training going on, and I assume that would be publicly available information. Yes, I think that, I assume that's going on. I haven't checked in and verified that myself. And that's, of course, the fiendish thing about Special Forces operations, which is that everything starts out as training. The war in Vietnam, we had tens of thousands of soldiers there actively fighting for 3 or 4 years before the U.S. government would admit that they weren't just advisors or trainers. So to what degree the special forces in Mexico are trainers versus fighters, to what degree they are or are not doing things, is kind of an open question. I mean, maybe there's sort of a no-hope Republican candidate who's sort of talking about, well, we put our special forces in there, we would handle this in 5 minutes, or what have you. And it's entirely possible that we already do have special forces in there who've been trying to solve it.
Just it seems unlikely when you're talking about how many soldiers are in countries all around the world. It's hard to imagine they're not next door.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that Mexico has been very careful not to present a military threat to the United States. It's an interesting contrast in between different folks who are both interested in the United States getting more involved in Mexico, but have really different approaches to that. So you've got sort of the prestige press, the New York Times, the Atlantic. People would describe that as liberal press, but I think that's because they're not paying attention. Most fundamentally, it's militarist press. They publish a lot of folks from the Bush administration.
Pentagon press?
Yeah, the Pentagon press. So you've got the Atlantic, you've got the New York Times talking about how bad the current president is, and not actually coming out and saying, but implying that it'd be better if this Obrador guy was no longer president. And one of their main complaints is that Mexico is militarizing too much. And honestly, sometimes in the same article, these guys can also complain that Obrador isn't prosecuting the drug war with as much vigor as they'd like. There's a contrast, obviously, in their own arguments, but Washington, D.C. militarists have never been renowned for their consistency. Whereas on the other hand, you have Task and Purpose. This is the YouTube video that I uploaded a video complaining about their coverage. They seem perfectly on board with more of a bigger Mexican military. Actually, in that video, they advocate for a larger Mexican military. But I do know that Mexican political space would have a natural objection to anything that could be construed as U.S. occupation of the United States. So maybe they are more standoffish towards the idea of special forces training. I just don't have those details at my fingertips. I do know that in 2007, when Bush convinced Calderon to undertake this absurd, idiotic, to be clear, and this is a detail that gets left out of a lot of drug war discussion that is very much worth discussing. In 2006, and for a decade prior to that, murders in Mexico hovered around 10,000 a year. That's terrible. The United States in a given year has about 20,000 murders a year. Also, all murder is bad, but in countries that have as many guns as the United States does, and Mexico is forced to have by having that border with the United States, you're going to have a lot of murder. So proportionally, if you look at those population numbers, Mexico honestly probably had a lower murder rate to some extent than the United States in 2006, 2007. Since then, because, directly, I uploaded a video with the graph. It's really quite stunning. From the start of Bush and Calderon's acceleration of the drug war.
Yeah, it shoots up at around 2007.
Yep. Well, that's because that's when it started.
So it was around 10 deaths per 100,000. And now it's currently at around 25 deaths per 100,000. But yeah, it's over doubled.
Over tripled, in fact. So they went from 10,000 murders a year to 36,000 murders a year. And that is a direct result. And I think that this is sort of a two-step that a lot of folks like to do, is they don't like to really acknowledge how catastrophic, how horrifically catastrophic this Bush-Calderon choice was. Mexico was more or less at a U.S. level of violence in 2006 and 2007. And then through the conscious militarization of this, and folks will acknowledge that that's what happened in 2006 and 2007, the number of people dying in Mexico tripled, if not quadrupled. But folks won't talk about that so much. They won't talk about the decade before Bush and Calderon did this and created this horror show, because it is very much a horror show that they created. Quite nightmarish, frankly.
This is my 2 cents on the matter. Are you aware of Switzerland's drug policy?
I am not.
It's basically a lot of rehab. We treat this as an illness, and we'll provide you with the drugs that you're addicted to and do our very best to help you, which seems to have a great effect on, Switzerland's drug problem. They're not so keen on drugs. There isn't a big drug market because there isn't the same amount of people to buy it. There's a lot more help there, which I don't see in America. I feel if America, didn't want these drugs, you may not need this violence, but as you say, there's not that much money in rehabilitation compared to... Also, the horrible thing is quite often when you see criminal types, it's a lot of the Soviet weapons, but here it's America's finest.
Oh, yeah. No, it's all American weapons.
It's a huge... there must obviously... We were talking about the doctors turning a blind eye to the fentanyl, or, encouraging it. There must be gun shops in America that are just yep, fill your boots, Mexican cartels.
Well, the manufacturers don't have to do it. There's a very strong culture of gun shows and stores, and I don't think that anybody disputes that there's, if you're a gun store in southern Texas, you're probably supplying Mexico really, really heavily. I think that's, you can pretend you're not. I'm sure most pretend they're not. But it's definitely what's going on. Quite horrifying. I think you're entirely correct that the United States would be much more successful if we focused on treatment more. And while we 100% do have the resources necessary to do that, but I find it would be quite a transformation for the United States to focus as heavily culturally. Yeah, I don't know that we're capable of it, and I think that's a key point, is just how many people benefit from this. And this is a really key point that I didn't realize until I was doing the graphics for that YouTube video. There's this new controversial president. People refer to him as new, and they shouldn't. He's been president since 2019. He's already more than halfway through this term. He has argued for a hugs, not bullets policy, and he's had trouble implementing that because of massive pushback from both the Mexican and American law enforcement communities. But the kind of extraordinary thing is that he's actually pulling it off. If you look at the murder rates, these are, I believe, official Mexican government statistics, so you can make an argument that maybe he's gaming them. The number of murders has fallen by 15% since his first year in office, and this is his this is his fifth year in office. The two Mexican presidents prior to him, from their first to fourth year in office, experienced rises in the murder rate, or the raw number of deaths, between 50% and 200%. A fall of 15% is kind of stunning. Obviously, if you're looking at a country that has murders that are counted in 30,000, 3 times what it was before the Bush-Calderon war was launched, obviously it's hard to call that a full success, but the trajectory is actually very good. Hugs Not Bullets, to the very limited extent that it's been able to be put into place, seems to be working dramatically, successfully. And this is ignored in almost every think piece and YouTube video that is put out about this controversy. So it's kind of fascinating that we're just not acknowledging, even in supposedly big deep dives on the narco war, we're not acknowledging that for the past 4 years, the number of deaths have fallen. So my hope is that folks look at this history, both over the course of a century and over the past dramatically failed 16 years now of the Bush-Calderon drug war, and realize that more violence is not going to solve this. I can't make an uncritical case for President Obrador. I think there are a lot of shortcomings to that guy. But I think fundamentally his policy on the drug war isn't just working, it's fundamentally correct. We can't just continue to squash every new narco group that shows up, which then leads to 5 more narco groups. It is a policy that is simply not working. It's failing calamitously. And we need to cut it out. And I think inevitably that is the choice that we're going to make. We're inevitably going to pick some group of narcos to win, and then hopefully over the course of a generation or two, as was the case with the mafia in the United States, the economy and society of Mexico can evolve beyond that sort of narco setup. But the most important thing is to stop the violence, and then more carefully and surgically, the Mexican government, with support from the United States, if the Mexican government asks for it, can more surgically push criminal elements out of more and more of the economy. Because as a lot of folks I disagree with have emphasized, the incredible opportunity that Mexico has now that the United States is as committed as it is to cutting out Mexico. Mexico has a tremendous opportunity for transformation, and that money can flow much more easily if the violence can stop. And that money can help transition the economy into a more open, legal, and less corrupt way of functioning. To be clear, the Mexican economy is already massively, massively, massively larger than the narcotics element. It was the Bush-Calderon choice in 2007 to launch the war at this scale that has allowed corruption to make its way further and further into the Mexican economy. The key thing to stop this spread of narco businesses, this, that, and the other thing, is to stop the violence first. And I think that Obrador seems to have a policy that's beginning to make that happen, and I think he should be allowed to do that. I think there's elements in Washington, D.C. that have almost seen the narco wars as an opportunity, as something to have in their pocket that they can jump into and justify their defense budgets with. And I think a little bit, not most of it, a little bit of the current outcry in Washington, D.C. against Mexico has something to do with the fact that more savvy folks are noticing that this opportunity may be slipping away. So I know it's not very satisfying to say, let's not do anything about the Mexican drug war, but that is the policy we should have taken in 2007. The world would have been a much happier place if that is the approach we had taken, and I think we should take it now.
I think that was a wonderful ending, and we'll catch you next time as we go a bit more looser. What would you describe?
I would say speculative. I think we're gonna
speculative episode on Mexico-American relations.
Yes, sort of call it Mexico and the U.S. Civil War, the second U.S. Civil War.
Lovely.
Indeed.
Well, we'll catch you then. All the best. The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.